There are many names that echo through the violent corridors of World War II. Churchill, Roosevelt, Patton, Montgomery, Rommel, and Stalin. Each man carried a legacy carved into history by fire and steel. Yet, deep inside the hardened fortress headquarters of Adolf Hitler, there was one name that stirred more anxiety, more strategic panic, and more sleepless nights than any other. It was not the fiery George S. Patton, whose aggression terrified German commanders. It was not Bernard Montgomery, whose discipline shaped the North African campaign. It was not even the brilliant Soviet war machine crushing the Eastern Front. The man Hitler feared most was quiet, calm, polite, and almost invisible to the public. His name was Dwight David Eisenhower, a general whose strength did not lie in theatrics or rage, but in something far more dangerous: unity, unpredictability, and unbreakable resolve. Hitler, sitting inside his bunker, understood the battlefield better than most people give him credit for. He studied his enemies carefully, analyzing their minds as much as their armies. Patton was loud and predictable, a bulldozer of war, always ready to attack head-on. Montgomery was methodical and slow, a perfectionist whose style rarely changed. MacArthur in the Pacific was dramatic, ambitious, and deeply political. All of them were obvious threats, but they were understandable. Their decisions could be anticipated. Their patterns could be recognized. But Eisenhower, he was different. He was the storm no one could see forming, the quiet whisper that turned into a roaring hurricane. Hitler recognized early that Eisenhower possessed a terrifying ability: the power to make the world move together. Before Eisenhower ever commanded an army in battle, he was underestimated. Many American officers saw him as just another staff man, brilliant planner, perhaps, but not a warrior. He had never commanded troops in combat before becoming supreme commander. To military traditionalists, this seemed ridiculous. How could a man with no battlefield experience command the greatest invasion force in history? But Hitler saw what others missed. Eisenhower's power came not from rage or ego, but from strategic intelligence and diplomacy. He could bring together egos and rivals, turning them into a unified fist against tyranny. The British adored him, the Americans respected him, and even the French trusted him, a miracle considering the painful history between nations. And if Hitler feared anything, it was a world united against him. In the early years of the war, Nazi Germany dominated Europe. France fell in 6 weeks. Britain stood alone, bloodied and exhausted. The Soviet Union was bleeding millions. Hitler felt invincible, convinced the world would never unite against him. But when he received intelligence briefings about Eisenhower's rise, his expression changed. He reportedly slammed his fist on the table when hearing that Eisenhower had been appointed supreme commander of the Allied forces, not because of the man's rank, but because Hitler recognized what it symbolized. It meant the Allies were no longer fragmented. It meant Roosevelt and Churchill had chosen a leader capable of merging strategy, politics, and humanity into a single unstoppable machine. Hitler knew that the moment the Allies acted as one, Germany was doomed. Eisenhower's leadership did not rely on force. It relied on respect. He listened instead of shouted. He negotiated instead of demanded. He inspired instead of intimidated. Soldiers loved him because he understood them, truly understood them. He walked among his men, shook their hands, looked them in the eyes, and reminded them what they were fighting for: not territory, not power, but freedom, families, and the right to live without fear. He knew the names of privates and corporals. He read their letters. He ate with them. He cried quietly when he received casualty reports. Eisenhower's strength was deeply emotional, and that terrified Hitler. Because soldiers do not fight hardest for orders. They fight hardest for someone they believe in. When Hitler looked at Eisenhower, he saw a leader capable of something that dictators could never grasp: loyalty built from love, not fear. Hitler controlled his army through terror and obedience. Generals were executed for questioning him. Soldiers were shot for retreating. He led through paranoia. Eisenhower led through unity, and unity was far deadlier than fear. But Hitler's fear grew into panic when he recognized Eisenhower's strategic power. Eisenhower was a master of deception and unpredictability. Operation Torch stunned the Germans. Eisenhower orchestrated an invasion of North Africa that Hitler never anticipated, opening a new front that pulled German forces thin. Then came Sicily, where Eisenhower supervised the campaign that cracked Italy's defenses and forced Mussolini to crumble. Hitler realized that every time Eisenhower touched a battlefield, Germany lost ground. He was like a chess player, sacrificing short-term moves to control the board. He didn't fight battles. He fought wars. Yet the moment that truly shook Hitler to his core came in the months leading up to D-Day. Hitler knew an invasion of France was coming. The Allied buildup made it obvious. He placed his faith in the Atlantic Wall, a monstrous defensive line stretching across the coast. He positioned Rommel, his desert fox, to stop any landing. He believed that if he could repel the Allies once, they would never try again. But Eisenhower outplayed him with a deception so brilliant that historians still study it today. Operation Fortitude convinced Hitler that the invasion would hit Pas de Calais, not Normandy. Eisenhower built fake armies, fake radio signals, fake tanks, and fake generals. He turned illusion into a weapon, and Hitler believed every word. Even when troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, even when blood turned the tide red, even when 156,000 soldiers shattered the Atlantic Wall, Hitler still thought it was a diversion. He refused to move his armored divisions. He refused to allow flexibility. He trusted his instincts more than reality, and Eisenhower used that flaw to break the gates of Europe. D-Day was not simply a victory of strength. It was a victory of mind. It was the moment Hitler realized that Eisenhower was not merely a general. He was the architect of Germany's collapse. Hitler's fear was not irrational. He watched the map change before his eyes. Allied forces crushed resistance across France. The German army retreated again and again. The people who once welcomed Hitler as a savior now begged for mercy. Cities fell, supply lines shattered, and with every defeat, one message became clearer. Eisenhower was not coming to negotiate. He was coming to finish the war forever. Inside the bunker, Hitler ranted about Eisenhower constantly. He accused his generals of incompetence. He demanded miracles. But deep down, he understood the truth. He had finally met someone he could not out-hink, intimidate, or predict. A man whose calmness was more terrifying than any battlefield roar. A man who could carry the weight of the world without breaking. A man whose victory was not fueled by hatred, but by faith in humanity. Eisenhower once said quietly, "We are not going into Europe to conquer. We are going to liberate," and those words may have frightened Hitler more than any weapon ever could. Because tyrants fear hope. They fear unity. They fear the power of ordinary people standing together. And Eisenhower gave the world that power. He gave people a reason to believe again. And Hitler knew, when people believe, dictators fall. The deeper the Allies pushed into Europe, the more visibly Hitler's fear of Eisenhower began to consume him. Each morning, inside the concrete shell of the Führerbunker, briefings grew shorter, angrier, more frantic. Hitler's generals watched, his hands tremble as he unfolded maps covered in red arrows signaling retreats and lost positions. Every message that reported Eisenhower's progress stabbed him like a knife. He could not understand how a man he once dismissed as an inexperienced staff officer could dismantle the German war machine, piece by piece, with terrifying precision. The war that Hitler believed he controlled now seemed controlled by Eisenhower's invisible hand, reshaping borders, alliances, and the fate of nations. The Allies' rapid advance across France left Hitler struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his miscalculation. Villages liberated one after another showed the world a truth Germany tried desperately to hide. People were not waiting to embrace Nazi rule. They were waiting to wake up from a nightmare. Civilians lined the roads cheering Allied troops, crying, waving flags, handing flowers, lifting children to see the soldiers who symbolized hope. And at the center of this unstoppable wave stood Eisenhower, the quiet conductor, guiding millions with a steady hand and an iron resolve. The love the liberated people felt for him became a weapon Hitler could never defeat. What frightened Hitler most was that Eisenhower possessed a trait dictators never understand: humility. Instead of demanding glory, Eisenhower stepped aside and allowed other generals to take the spotlight. He praised Montgomery. He admired Patton's ferocity. He respected Bradley's calm intelligence. He listened to every voice in the room before making decisions. This humility made him unpredictable, because Hitler could not imagine a leader refusing absolute control. Eisenhower did not fight to prove his own greatness. He fought for peace, and Hitler had no defense against a mission greater than ego. Eisenhower had another weapon. Hitler underestimated the ability to manage impossible personalities. The Allied command was a furnace of rivalry. Patton and Montgomery fought constantly for recognition. British and American perspectives clashed over strategy. Politicians back home demanded results and questioned tactics. Any other general might have watched the alliance collapse under pressure, but Eisenhower held it together with almost superhuman patience. He understood that anger was a luxury he could never afford. He spoke softly, rarely raised his voice, and always reminded his commanders of the real enemy, not each other, but the dictatorship spreading misery across the world. While Hitler screamed at his generals, calling them cowards and traitors, Eisenhower placed his hands on men's shoulders and said, "We will win because we fight together." The contrast was so stark that German commanders later confessed that they envied Allied leadership. Some secretly wished they had been led by someone like Eisenhower, a man who inspired courage instead of fear. Inside Germany, the illusion of invincibility shattered. Hitler desperately hoped his new secret weapons, rockets, jet aircraft, and experimental tanks would change the war. He ordered counterattacks, driven not by strategy but by rage. He convinced himself a single massive blow could stop Eisenhower's progress. And so emerged the final gamble of the German war effort, the Battle of the Bulge, the last major offensive. On the Western Front, Hitler believed that if he could split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp, the unity Eisenhower had built would crack. He hoped British and American forces would turn on each other, placing blame and losing trust. But Eisenhower saw through the chaos. Even as blistering snowstorms trapped soldiers in freezing forests and skies turned black with German artillery, Eisenhower refused to panic. People around him watched in awe as he stood before a map and quietly declared, "The present situation is to our advantage. The enemy has created the greatest opportunity for us." To most, his words sounded absurd. How could disaster be an advantage? But Eisenhower understood that the German offensive had exposed their weakness. Instead of retreating, he made a bold decision to attack into the Bulge from both sides, crushing the German forces in a pincer movement. It was a strategy that required nerve, patience, and faith in his commanders. Patton arrived like a thunderstorm. In what is still considered one of the greatest military maneuvers in history, he pivoted his entire Third Army north through freezing roads in less than 3 days, rescuing the surrounded 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne. When reporters asked Eisenhower how he knew Patton could move so fast, Eisenhower smiled softly and said, "Because I asked him to." It was trust, the strongest weapon in war. When news reached Hitler that his final hope had collapsed, he screamed in fury, refusing to believe reality. He accused his generals of betrayal, demanded impossible orders, and insisted he would still find a miracle. But there were no miracles coming. Eisenhower had proven that unity defeated chaos, discipline defeated rage, and wisdom defeated madness. By early 1945, German cities lay in ruins. Refugees flooded roads. The once mighty German army crumbled into broken remnants. The war Hitler started to dominate. The world now felt like a machine grinding itself to dust. And yet, he still asked every morning for one update more than any other. Where is Eisenhower now? The answer became more haunting every day. Eisenhower stood on the border of Germany itself, closer and closer to the heart of the Reich. Hitler could feel his presence like a shadow, crawling across the bunker walls, tightening around him with every hour. Eisenhower was no longer merely a military opponent. He had become the symbol of inevitability, the embodiment of Hitler's failure. What Hitler never understood was that Eisenhower's strength did not come from hatred of Germany or revenge for losses. It came from a belief deeper than any weapon, the belief that ordinary people deserve peace, dignity, and the chance to rebuild their lives. As the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine River, the final barrier to the collapse of Nazi rule, Eisenhower visited troops personally, walking through mud and trenches, shaking hands with soldiers whose uniforms were frozen from nights slept in snow. Many cried upon seeing him, some unable to speak, overcome by emotion. Eisenhower told them softly, "The world is watching you. You are giving future generations their freedom." Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler paced restlessly, his face pale, his eyes sunken from insomnia. He could hear the thunder of artillery growing closer. The ground trembled beneath him. Every explosion outside whispered the same truth. Eisenhower was coming, and nothing could stop him. The dictator who once ruled continents found himself trapped like a prisoner in his own fortress, haunted not by Patton's fiery rage nor Montgomery's measured precision, but by the quiet strength of a man he had once dismissed as weak. And as the doors of Germany's final defenses cracked open, Hitler finally understood the truth he had spent years refusing to accept. He had never truly feared Allied armies. He feared the man leading them. The winter ice began to thaw across Europe as 1945 unfolded, but inside Hitler's bunker, the cold only grew sharper. Every hour brought another devastating update. Cities lost, units shattered, loyal officers surrendering in tears. The once proud Nazi empire was collapsing faster than even its enemies believed possible. What Hitler feared for years was now undeniable. Dwight D. Eisenhower had reached the gates of Germany, and the thunder of Allied artillery sounded like the heartbeat of justice itself. Each blast shook the concrete walls overhead, and every trembling vibration whispered the same truth. The end was inevitable. In his final months, Hitler stopped asking for status reports on the Soviet advance, stopped demanding information about supply lines or defenses. Instead, he repeatedly asked one question that stunned even his closest circle: "Where is Eisenhower?" Those words revealed something no propaganda machine could hide. Hitler's greatest fear was not being defeated by overwhelming numbers or destroyed by superior weaponry. His greatest fear was losing to a man who represented everything he could never comprehend: compassion, unity, and a world built on cooperation instead of terror. Eisenhower was the counterforce to Hitler's ideology, the living proof that humanity could rise against hatred and prevail. While Hitler descended into paranoia and delusion, Eisenhower moved steadily forward, every decision calculated, every step measured. In March of 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine River, the symbolic heart of Germany, believed by Hitler to be an impenetrable line. When Eisenhower's forces secured the bridge at Remagen, opening the gateway to Germany's core, panic swept through the Nazi command, screaming that his generals had betrayed him, ordering executions, demanding counterattacks that no longer existed. But Eisenhower understood something deeper. He knew the German people were exhausted, broken, and longing for peace. He refused to bomb civilians unnecessarily. He refused to punish ordinary people for the crimes of their leaders. Even in victory, he showed restraint, and that restraint terrified Hitler more than destruction ever could. Eisenhower ordered leaflets dropped from planes, telling German soldiers and civilians they could surrender safely. He opened humanitarian corridors. He allowed medical aid to reach suffering families. While Hitler ranted and cursed the world for abandoning him, Eisenhower spoke of forgiveness, rebuilding, and hope. He delivered something more powerful than vengeance: dignity. And that was a form of leadership far beyond the reach of tyrants. The end closed in like a tightening fist. Soviet armies pushed from the east. Eisenhower's forces closed from the west. Germany was trapped, compressed between two unstoppable forces. Yet even as Berlin disintegrated and loyalists abandoned the sinking regime, Hitler clung to one belief: Maybe Eisenhower would break. Maybe the Allies would fracture. Maybe the Americans and Soviets would turn on each other. For years, he had gambled on division, convinced fear would control the world forever. But this time, the world did not break apart because Eisenhower ensured it did not. He met with world leaders, managed every fragile political thread, and kept the alliance intact through skill, patience, and quiet strength. On April 12, 1945, tragedy struck. President Franklin D. Roosevelt died suddenly. The news swept across the world like a dark wind, shaking morale and sending waves of grief across Allied forces. Soldiers cried openly, civilians fell to their knees, leaders feared instability, and Hitler, upon hearing the news, smiled for the first time in months. He believed it was the sign he had been waiting for, the fracture that would destroy unity and give him the chance to survive. But he underestimated Eisenhower once again. Instead of falling apart, the Allies rallied stronger than ever. Eisenhower addressed his troops with steady resolve, reminding them that freedom was bigger than one man, bigger than any government, bigger than fear. His calm leadership prevented chaos, and the hope he carried became the torch that guided millions through the darkest days. Just 18 days later, Hitler faced reality. The war he started was not in glory, but in humiliation. Berlin was burning. The sound of Soviet artillery echoed like thunder rolling across the earth. The bunker lights flickered. Food supplies dwindled. Loyal officers abandoned him. Even the most fanatical supporters disappeared into the smoke. Hitler retreated into silence, shaking, broken, staring at maps that no longer mattered. And somewhere above ground, as buildings crumbled and the sky filled with ash, Germany could hear the footsteps of approaching liberation. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life inside that bunker. Unable to face the consequences of the world he tried to destroy, his empire of fear collapsed with him, reduced to ashes under the weight of his own madness. 2 days later, German commanders reached out to Eisenhower, requesting surrender. The man Hitler feared most received the message with calm dignity. He entered the surrender room not with triumph in his eyes, but with sorrow for the millions who had suffered. When the German delegation signed the documents that ended the war in Europe, Eisenhower did not celebrate. He simply nodded and said quietly, "The mission of this command has been fulfilled." The room fell silent. Some officers wiped tears from their eyes. Others bowed their heads in respect. In that moment, the entire world understood what made Eisenhower truly powerful. He did not win through hatred or destruction. He won through leadership rooted in humanity. He won because he saw beyond the battlefield into the hearts of the people fighting it. He won because he believed that war was not about crushing enemies. It was about healing the world. Afterward, the news spread like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Victory in Europe. The war was over. Hitler was gone. Freedom had returned. People poured into the streets crying, singing, hugging strangers, ringing church bells, filling cities with a joy that felt almost unreal after 6 long years of darkness. And while celebrations thundered across the earth, Eisenhower walked among his soldiers quietly, shaking their hands, thanking them for their sacrifice. He carried the weight of every life lost, every home destroyed, every family broken. He never glorified war. He never raised his voice in triumph. Instead, he said 6 words that revealed everything inside his heart. "I hate war as only a soldier can." Years later, when Eisenhower became President of the United States, the world looked at him not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of peace. He rebuilt Europe, prevented starvation, opened doors instead of closing them, and worked tirelessly to ensure that the horrors he witnessed would never return. And yet, the question remains, why did Hitler fear Eisenhower more than any other general? It was not because Eisenhower commanded the strongest army. It was not because he executed the most brilliant strategy. It was not because he won the greatest victory of the war. It was because Dwight D. Eisenhower represented the one force tyrants fear above all: the unity of free people. He commanded not soldiers, but hope. He fought not for power, but for humanity. He won not through fear, but through trust. Hitler built his empire on division and terror. Eisenhower destroyed it with unity and compassion. And that is why, in the darkest years of human history, the most feared man in Adolf Hitler's eyes was the quiet general from Kansas, whose greatest weapon was the belief that ordinary people, standing together, could defeat the greatest evil the world had ever seen. That is why Hitler feared Eisenhower more than any other general. And history will remember that in the end, it was not hate that conquered tyranny. It was courage. It was unity. It was hope.